I want to be able to write some tests that will test the functionality of my gradebook. So I'm going to right click on grades.tests on that project and let's add a class. Because tests are nothing more than code that exists inside of test methods that are inside of a test class. So I will call this class gradebook tests and press enter. Visual Studio will add that class to the project. I want this to be a test class. And in order to use that attribute, I'm going to need the namespace that we talked about earlier, microsoft.visualstudio.testtools.unittesting. And the easiest way to add that is to click on the light bulb and then select that option. I now have that using statement in place, and I can write a test method, my first test method. So there's various philosophies about how to name your test classes, how to name your test methods, how much code to put inside of a method in a class. I'm going to leave it up to all the other Pluralsight videos about unit testing to talk about the different perspectives and subtleties of how to organize test code. For right now, I'm just going to brute force my way, and here's what I want to do. I want to be able to instantiate a gradebook, I want to be able to give it some data, and I want to write assertions to make sure that the gradebook computes the correct highest grade. And to do that, I'm going to write a public method that does not return anything, so I'll use the void keyword. This method, I'll just name it computes highest grade, and inside of the method, I want to use the gradebook. Right now, there are a couple obstacles that will prevent me from using the gradebook. One obstacle is that grades.test, this assembly doesn't know about the other project, the grades project, even though they're in the same solution. I'm not going to be able to use gradebook until I establish a reference from grades.tests to the grades. So just like I did with the speech synthesizer, let me right-click references and select add reference. But this time, instead of selecting a framework assembly, I'm going to go to this projects node. The projects node will list all of the other projects that are available in a solution, which makes it very easy to just come in and select a checkbox and say, yes, I want to reference the assembly that is produced by this other project, the grades assembly. That will give me a reference to that other project, but I still have another obstacle. If I look at the error that Visual Studio is giving me, it's telling me that gradebook is inaccessible due to its protection level. So when you start working with multiple assemblies, you need to know a little bit more about protection levels than I've described so far. Let's look at the gradebook. Protection levels are established by those access modifiers that we talked about in the last module. Access modifiers like public and private. We know that if I mark a field or any class member as private, that field is not available to the code that is outside of this class. That's one way to achieve encapsulation in C#, and anything I make public will be available to anyone who writes code who has an instance of gradebook around. So we've seen these keywords on class members, but what I didn't tell you is that there's also access modifiers available at the class level. And by default, if you don't specify the access level for a class, by default, it will be internal. And there's actually a C# keyword that I could place here to make that very explicit. This is an internal class. And internal class can only be used by code that is inside of the same project. So when a gradebook is internal, I can use this in other places inside of the same project. So I can use the gradebook from program.cs, it's part of the same assembly, but I will not be able to use gradebook from gradebook tests. It's essentially hidden from this project. If I want to make gradebook available, I need to explicitly mark this class as public. That means I can use this gradebook inside of this assembly, the grades assembly, as well as from any assembly that references the grades assembly. And yes, grades is a .exe file, which we don't typically think of as a library that someone else would consume. But in .NET, it's perfectly legal to reference a DLL or an exe file. So the test project is referencing the grades project. It will now have access to this gradebook class. It will be able to instantiate it, except the C# compiler is going to check the access levels of all the classes that are involved with the gradebook. And you can see right now I have an error. This error is an inconsistent accessibility error. It's telling me that grade statistics is less accessible than the method compute statistics. It's a complicated error message, but it's actually easy to reason through this one. Compute statistics is available to anyone who has access to a gradebook, but compute statistics returns an object that is of type grade statistics. And if we look at grade statistics, the problem is that this class, by default, is an internal class. It's not visible outside of the project. So it doesn't make sense to give access to a method that anyone can use if it returns a type that no one outside can see. And there's a couple different ways to solve this problem. One way to solve this problem is that I can use that internal keyword to mark just this method as internal. And that means anyone will be able to see this class even outside assemblies, but only code inside of the same assembly will be able to see and invoke this method. But I consider this part of the public API for a gradebook, and certainly from my unit testing project, I want to be able to instantiate a gradebook and give it some data and then ask it to compute statistics. So I want this to be a public method. And because I'm returning something that is of grade statistics, the other way to solve this problem is to make this class public also. Now anyone who references the assembly can reach the gradebook, they can reach grade statistics, they can invoke compute statistics. Everything should work for me. So inside of gradebook tests, all I need now is my namespace grades, and I should be able to declare a variable of type gradebook and instantiate a gradebook. Tell the book to add a grade. Let's choose a grade of 10, and let's choose a grade of 90. And now let's get some statistics. So grade statistics, the result, that is what happens when I call book.compute statistics. And now I want to write an assertion. I want to assert that the following two things are equal. I expect a value of 90 when I ask for result.highestGrade. And with that assert in place, let me go to test and say, run all the tests. Visual Studio will build the project. And then you'll notice a funny thing here. It doesn't seem to execute the test. It doesn't seem to find that test. Over here, it says one test passed, but that was the last test run. And I don't see a test listing in this window. That's because the test runner is only going to execute the test code that is inside of a class marked with test class, that attribute. And it also has to be a public class. By default, this class was internal. It was only visible to code that was inside of the same project. Now I've made it public. Let me try to run the tests one more time. And I can see that that test is passing and my gradebook is producing the right result. What happens if someone comes into the gradebook and they manipulate code to the point where the gradebook no longer works properly? That's when my test should fail. // by the way, is a way to comment out a single line of code in C# so it doesn't execute. And now anytime I make changes to compute statistics, I at least have one test in place that will make sure the gradebook is doing part of its job correctly. Let's write just a few more tests and see if we can make this a little more robust.